The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back. Giants baseball, past, present, and future. I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. The host of the show is the esteemed Michael Duca. How are you, sir?
I am well, Ralph. Good to be back.
Yeah, it would have been back sooner if I didn't have to take 4 takes to get us on the air. But
you didn't have to tell anybody that.
No, I know. It's truth in advertising. That's one thing about podcasting and me. At least I didn't run it over and over again. I started again. So here we go in another week of hot stove baseball. Much to talk about from my memory bank and yours. I was going to lead with the Year of the Fox, 1971. Charlie Fox led the Giants into the playoffs, and you mentioned something off the air that I would really like to pursue, and that you mentioned it first as the difference of being a fan from 50 years ago till now. And I immediately said, why don't we talk about the differences in your job, the official scorer, from 50 years ago? When you were a kid, the official scorer was just had a different way of doing his job. And you can elaborate on that if you would.
Well, I'm not sure that the job was tremendously different, but what was different was how people were assigned to it. Until about 20 years ago, all official scorers were active members of the Baseball Writers Association and were currently employed beat writers. The last one that I know of to be in that position was John Hickey, who worked here in the Bay Area for many, many years for the, I want to say he worked for the Hayward Review before it became absorbed into the Bay Area News Group. And
the Alameda group.
Well, the Times Star was part of that group now, and the Oakland Tribune, and the San Jose paper is now part of it. But at that time, those papers were all independent, and John worked for the one in Hayward, and he was the last active writer to also be an official scorer. And it became clear that there was a conflict of interest in doing it that way. I mean, if you decide that the critical play of the game was an error on the third baseman, and then you have to go down and interview the third baseman and talk to him about the error, it becomes a little bit of a Hobson's choice for people. The third baseman is going to be aware that he's sitting there talking with the guy who hung the unearned runs on him, because that's on, whoever is the official scorer is listed on the lineup sheet each day. So, for whatever number of reasons, baseball decided that wasn't the best way to do that, and now it's mostly retired BBWAA members and or other people like myself who had other jobs in the game that allowed us to be present for 100 to 120 games a year for a number of years in a row before we were appointed. But another way that the job has changed and the way you perform the job has changed is replay. And there's, if you will, a little bit of an ethical dilemma that you have to solve if you're a scorer and you're equipped with replay. And that is, do you use replay to make your calls, or do you make your calls, maybe silently to yourself, and then use replay to confirm that you saw what you thought you saw? And the difference in those may not seem very important, but it actually is, because at least to my way of thinking, one of the primary functions of an official scorer is to be a custodian of the integrity of baseball's historical records. I can't change how many doubles Ty Cobb hit, but I can make sure that anybody who is challenging the record for doubles is being called the way it was called 50 or 80 or 100 years ago. In other words, a double then has to be a double now, unless the rules themselves change. I mean, 100 or 110 years ago, there were ropes in the outfield, and a ball that rolled into the crowd was a ground rule triple. We no longer have ground rule triples. We do have, you can be awarded third base if somebody throws their glove or a piece of equipment at the ball and strikes it. But you cannot have a ground rule triple based on an actual ground rule. But if something hasn't changed like that, then you should be able to compare something across eras, and that leads you to the question of, well, gee, what do you do? I mean, guys who scored all those games played in the Polo Grounds, guys who scored all those games played in Baker Bowl, they didn't have replay. They didn't have television.
Right.
So, they were writing game stories. They were sitting behind, upright typewriters, clacking away and watching the game. There are all manner of great stories that come out of New York in the 1940s, but my favorite, and Ralph, you might help me here because I'm struggling to remember the name. The New York Times had a reporter who covered the Brooklyn Dodgers in the 40s. And I know his name like the back of my hand. It wasn't Dan Daly.
Dick Young covered the Dodgers more than anybody, but he wasn't a Times reporter.
He was for the Post, wasn't he?
He was for the maybe
for
later
the
on
news.
in his career he went to the Post, but he was the Daily News.
Daily News, okay. Well, the Times did have a gentleman who covered for the Dodgers, who was also famous for enjoying his time at Aqueduct.
Was it a guy named McGowan? Not McGowan, like Bruce McGowan, but boy.
Well, let's not obsess over the name. The story holds true nonetheless in that there was an afternoon game that started earlier than usual, and this particular beat writer was also scheduled to be the official scorer that day, and he did not realize that the game started early and he was at the racetrack. So he got to the game around the fifth inning, and he walked into the press box, and he said, the typical newspaperman's line. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. Catch me up. So the writer sitting next to him began reading to him off his scorecard what had happened so far in the game. And he got to the third inning or so, and he said, and there was a ball hit deep to right field, and Ferrillo made the most incredible catch I have ever seen, and this guy just deadpan without missing a beat said, I'll be the judge of that. It was definitely different in those days. Believe it or not, there wasn't even a microphone or a press box PA system in the 40s, 50s, and some press boxes even into the 60s. Hits and errors were signaled either with a thumbs up or a thumbs down by the official scorer, or sometimes they would have a red or green card that they would hold up so that people could see. So it was different. And of course, you have, if you stop and think about what was used as a glove, even in the 1950s, as a kid growing up, I had an Alvin Dark model glove that's almost the dead ringer for the glove that's sitting out on that structure in left field at AT&T Park in San Francisco. 4 fingers, single piece of leather in the pocket. The thumb was about 5 inches thick. It seemed
flat.
Like. Yeah, absolutely flat. You could sit in it. it was, you know, and stop and think about guys trying to make plays like that. I mean, if you compared Willie Mays' center field glove with Brett Butler's center field glove, you could put two of Willie's gloves in Brett's glove. Literally.
I remember they were measuring gloves at that time when Brett Butler was playing center field, and there was some sort of controversy. I don't know if it was 16 inches or 18 inches, but I do remember a controversy. He had the biggest glove around. He had a softball glove, basically.
Well, the players would tease him. Hispanic players told him he was wearing a cesta. I don't know if you know what a cesta is, Ralph, but it's the basket-shaped thing that they use to play highlight.
Yes, I know the game of highlight really well. I had relatives in Miami, in Florida, and we got to see that. That's a very skilled game, by the way. Just in the line of hand.
I hope so, because it's a game that's used for gambling. So one would hope that there's a lot of skill involved.
Yes. Now, and there are no scandals. I haven't heard any highlight scandals over a lifetime. I did a show last night on the early basketball scandals, and one of the panelists noted, well, there's a basketball scandal every 10 years. So, if you
of one sort or another. I mean, at least they haven't been as bad as the Manhattan NYU-based scandals of the 1950s. At least to our knowledge, we've been able to keep organized crime and point fixing out of the game for the most part since then.
Talked about that last night with Hal Bach of the Associated Press and a writer named Stan Cohen, who wrote a book on those very scandals. And it was the Jack Molinas years, and Alex Groza was suspended. Lou Groza's brother couldn't play in the NBA after a little bit. And guys went to jail. Literally were corded off buses and taken away. So each sport has a certain amount of, shall we say, shady years or controversial years. Baseball's no exception. Baseball's
absolutely
had a lot
true.
of controversy.
Absolutely true. And, you know, to get back to your original thought here on the 1971 season, I was in college in 1971. I went to college in La Jolla, University of California at San Diego. And so, to a certain extent, I was a little bit luckier than some folks who were away from their teams. I could pick up both the Padres radio and the Dodgers radio. So for the better part of, it would have been, 36 games at that point? I think 9 in each direction for the two teams. So for about 36 games, I was able to listen to the Giants. And fortunately, their final game of the year, Juan Marshall pitched them to victory, and they snuck into the playoffs. And that was against the Padres. So I was able to listen to that game.
But it was
my memories of that
an
year
historic season for a lot of reasons. But you're talking about picking up games on the radio brings back one of my memories. I'm a native New Yorker. I was stationed out at Travis Air Force Base and got here in 1966. And I got my little transistor radio, as was my wont growing up, and I turn it on, and miraculously, I'm picking up Pittsburgh. Well, it wasn't that much of a miracle. It was Pittsburgh, California I was picking up. I thought if I could get Pittsburgh, I could get New York just going outside with my antenna. Pull the antenna up, I'll get a few more miles, I'll be able to pick up WOR in New York. And I went out, I didn't know it was Pittsburgh, California. Didn't even know there was a Pittsburgh, California. I go out to the
Because
BX
the
Base
silent.
Exchange. I buy the biggest radio they had, whatever it was, $30. I go back to the barracks. I say, well, I got New York with this little radio. Here I go the next night. I did pick up Pittsburgh again, the guy, and all of a sudden I realized it was Pittsburgh, California. I felt a little stupid, but it wasn't the first time. It wasn't. I didn't have to adjust much to that thinking, and it was a major disappointment, though. And from there, I realized that it wasn't so bad having Lon Simmons, and even though I couldn't get the Mets, I got Lon Simmons and Russ Hodges giving me the Giants. So, and they were terrific together. I can't say enough about my memories of the mid-'60s and all those many, many years in the '60s when they were second-place teams. That's basically why 71 is so important in my memory. I later got to interview Charlie Fox back in the '90s. He gave me an hour and a half on a cable television show I did out of Cal State Hayward. I invited Charlie Fox, Leonard Coppett came on. I'm trying to think, Joe DeMaestri, all the locals that were New York-based originally. It was just a great series of interviews, and Charlie Fox was gregarious and charming, and I was thrilled to spend time in his company, and his memories of going back, managing that 71 team, revolved around two things. It revolved around Willie Mays was the actual manager of that team. Charlie Fox used him as a captain on the field. He called pitches. He manipulated where the outfielders went. He was just described to me by Fox as a one of a kind, not just not just the stats, the home runs, this and that, but one of a kind as a technician or tactician on the field. He was something else. And Charlie also remembers that Chris Spire was coming up at that time. And he went to Charlie Fox. He went to Charles Stoneham, rather, did Charlie Fox in spring training. And he said, I want Chris Spire as my shortstop. He was like a 20-year-old kid. And I think he and Fuentes would be great together. And I think he should replace Hal Lanier. And Stoneham said, fine, do what you want. If it doesn't work, it's your job. you know that. So, but he did it, and it did work. They were terrific together. And I thought that and Dave Kingman coming up made it just a very, very interesting year all the way around.
Kingman that year had one of the, he only had, about 170 at-bats that year, something like that. But he had one of the greatest isolated power years anybody had ever seen. He was immensely productive in the low number of at-bats that he had for that team.
And incredibly fast going from first to third. To the point he would pick it up. He had this big gait, and he'd pick it up. He's a very, very good athlete. I don't know what kept him out of the Hall of Fame. I mean, his stats, but I don't know what kept him from having a Hall of Fame production career.
Well, it's very interesting because, right now at this moment, one of the big stories in baseball is Shohei Ohtani, the two-way player out of Japan, the young phenom who's both a pitcher and a power hitter. And everybody compares him to Babe Ruth and says they haven't seen the likes of him since the Babe Ruth. Well, Ruth was never a pitcher and a power hitter at the same time. He was a pitcher and a great one, and then he became a power hitter and stopped pitching. But Dave Kingman fits that mold. A lot of people don't realize this, but Dave Kingman was the Friday starter for Rod Dedeaux on the USC team. And that means that he was the number one pitcher on that staff. And that's saying something because the Saturday pitcher was a fellow by the name of George Thomas Seaver.
Whoa.
Those are my favorite little gotchas. Like Bill Russell was not the center on his high school basketball team. He wasn't good enough. Frank Robinson was the center on that team. And yes, that's Frank Robinson.
McClymonds High School in Oakland, California.
Yep.
Got to tell you about that. I don't know if you know, Michael, and we might have talked about this before. Out of that McClymonds High School team comes Veda Pinson, Kurt Flood, and Frank played on, ever so briefly, they played together. Also, they played American Legion together. And there were others, many others. There was a guy named Aaron Pointer, whose sisters were the Pointer sisters. And he went on to play with the Houston Astros and was longtime NFL ref, came out of McClymonds. Jesse Gonder, the catcher, came out of McClymonds. Paul Silas. What an incredible school. That's, but I did not know.
Indeed it was.
I didn't know that Frank Robinson beat out Bill Russell for starting center. That's incredible.
I like to say that it probably set the tone for the rest of Russ's career. It probably put a chip on his shoulder that he hasn't taken off yet.
Right. Incredible defense. And that outlet pass, he'd get the rebound and pass it out to Heinsohn in the, halfway up the court. Quick outlet pass would get them on the fast break, and that's what made the Celtics great. Along with their depth, they had 5 guards that could have been starters on any team in basketball. Casey Jones coming off the bench, Sharman Kuzi, Sam Jones was a bench player initially, Havlicek. It was a tremendous team. Boy,
they were, and they owed a
we went to round ball just like that.
Yeah. Well, what we're doing right here, see, this all actually wraps back together to your TV show. We are emulating the great Leonard Koppett, who's in both the baseball and basketball halls of fame.
Absolutely. And when I had an interview with him, he came into the studio. Michael Jordan was playing center field for AA in
Birmingham.
In Birmingham, absolutely. And his manager was Tito Francona's son, Terry, who later went on to manage the Red Sox in their first championship. Wow, I love talking sports with you.
Well, yeah, we're a little bit like, giving 2 mice some LSD and setting them in the maze. They may or may not find the cheese, but they're going to see a whole lot of the maze.
Right, down the road. So, who was the San Diego announcer? Did you have any when you were picking up games? Just out of curiosity.
The San Diego announcers in those
Jerry
days
Coleman.
Were Jerry Coleman and Al Coupe. And Al Coupe had done the minor league San Diego Padres. He was the sports director for the NBC outlet in San Diego, KOGO, which I think is no longer an NBC outlet. I think it switched affiliates. But it was Channel 10, and he also broadcast the Padres. He did, in those days, you would think that this wouldn't be so, but in the early 60s, when the Padres, when the PCL was pretty widespread. I mean, they had teams in Oklahoma City, and it was pretty far away from the Pacific Coast by then. They still did recreations. Al Capone did in-studio recreations with, a tone block and a pencil and a little, some pieces of sandpaper to create sound effects, and recreated the game off a ticker. There's a
exactly
lot
what Les Kiter did in New York, recreating San Francisco Giant baseball. He did that for 2 years after the New York Giants moved to San Francisco, and it was terrific. It did the job. It gave us I was 10 years old, 11, 12. And our Jones was taken care of. It was very difficult when a kid loses a baseball team or a football team or anything else. One of the reasons I'm so pissed at the Raiders, how they have the gall to come back after moving the first time, screw up the stadium entirely, leave big debts, and then end up moving again. And not even for the business idea. How about kids? They grow up following these teams, like I did with the Giants.
Well, there's a couple things that I will say about that. One of them is they ain't gone until they're gone. And if the current Senate and House versions of the tax reform plan go through, they may not be gone, because Las Vegas is putting up $800 million in tax-free bonds to help build that stadium, and tax-free bonds may not exist. So there's a shred of hope there, but beyond that, to me, the mistake isn't seeing the Raiders leave this time. To me, the mistake was in begging them to come back. Your ex is your ex for a reason.
Yes, when you think about it in those terms, would you want your ex back? Well, some days you would, but most days, this may not work out for you, as they say.
I mean, it's just the Raiders. To me, I thought the most poignant and at the same time ridiculous thing in the world was Mark Davis standing there saying, "I hope my dad's proud of me." Seriously, dude, you don't know your dad well enough to know that all you have to do to make him proud of you is get your hands in somebody else's pockets?
If you think back how Al Davis got the franchise in the first place.
From McGaw? Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. I told you I went to college in San Diego. My dean of students was a fellow named Will Smith. And Will Smith had been an All-American offensive tackle at the University of Michigan, and then went on to not only play with the Raiders, but to be friends with Bill McGaw. So I got the story of all of that, the inside story of that, and Eastmont Shopping Center from one of the actual participants.
Wow.
It's been a long while since I've had a healthy measure of respect for Al Davis, believe me.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Al Davis lied on his resume to be a coach. I don't know if he lied to the Army. He was a coach, an assistant coach for the... that's what it was. There was another Al Davis around, and he confused it on his resume. He confused the two, intentionally confused the two, and got hired as an assistant coach at Army. at West Point. And that's how his career got started, basically on a...
And wasn't he there at essentially... Did his career at Army overlap with Bob Knight?
Oh, that I don't know. That I don't know.
Boy, wouldn't that be an interesting office to be in?
Yes, absolutely. But I'll tell you what, I read an article back about 30 years ago when his wife was incredibly sick, in the magazine...
Carol, yes, Carol.
I think it was called Inside Sports, a short-lived, really good magazine. And the article gave way to a book called Slick about Al Davis. And it portrayed him as being incredibly loyal to not only his wife, but those around him that were in his inner circle. I just got done seeing Godfather, just rented it the other day, and that's who he reminds me of, basically. Tremendously loyal to his people, and at the cost of society, basically.
Yeah, and there may be other similarities too. There have always been rumors that Al was connected.
Really?
Yeah. Now that may or may not just be, ordinary West Coast jealousy of a guy coming out from New York and being in control of a local franchise, but the rumors were always there that
I
is he or isn't
I read somewhere he wore a ring with Al on it, and that ring was initially Al Capone's. So sticks in the back of my memory some way, but that would not surprise me at all. That would not surprise. But would it? But I know, for instance, if you want to go back in NFL history of ownership, the Rosenblums that owned the Baltimore Colts. A lot of rumors about that. A lot of rumors about the Jets and the Colts game that ended up with Al Davis as the commissioner of the American League. That inordinately upset. It was an incredible upset. We're very well put together this morning, Ralphie boy. Let's keep it up. Big upset, and that was rumored to be controlled by the bookies and what have you. I know Jimmy Breslin referred to something of that order in a book. So,
welcome to technology. I'm not sure where I ducked out there, but for whatever reason, my phone began buzzing incessantly with a 14-digit number calling me from who knows where. But
okay, well, good. I was just mumbling a question that doesn't. You mentioned the possibility of Al Davis being connected, and I went on to talk about the Rosenblums of Baltimore, having rumors of that, rumors of the Jets Baltimore game being fixed while Al Davis was the commissioner of the American League, and the importance of that game in establishing, quote, parity between the leagues and selling advertising dollars so that they could basically merge. So the chances of Al being a little shady along those lines wouldn't surprise me.
No, I mean, it's pure speculation. I have zero information about that, and all I'm doing is trying to dredge up memories and recollections. And as we've seen in the news lately, recollection is a misty thing. I do not recall seems to be the popular answer of the day.
Yeah, well, today's version was brought to you by the Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Is he Attorney General? No, he's...
Yeah, well, he is. I mean, entitled.
Oh, he is. Okay.
Yeah.
That sets the tone for the American way these days. He doesn't remember Jeff Sessions. He couldn't remember that meeting, whether or not it was in Russia, whether or not that was somewhere else. Was Donald Jr. there? It's all very hazy to him. Great.
Well, yeah. I mean, what's fascinating is he didn't remember the meeting, and then when several people came forward and remembered the meeting, he said, "Well, I remember the meeting, but I don't remember what we talked about." And then when a couple of people mentioned what we talked about, he said, "Well, I don't know about all that. What I do know is that I told them that it would be wrong."
And this is the Attorney General. Incredible.
Yeah. Well,
what's even more incredible is Judge Roy Moore. Judge Roy Moore is setting the bar as low as possible for that elected position to be filled. I don't know, whoever it is that comes in that finally wins doesn't really have to be much of a go-getter. It's just you win almost by default, young man, and go with it. And thank God you're here, because that crazy has to be taken off the streets as well.
Well, you know, it's what's interesting in all of this is the fact that we have become so fractionalized and so polarized. The wedges have been driven so deep into our society now that approximately 1/3 of Alabama voters who self-identify as evangelicals have indicated that they are more likely to vote for him after the scandal broke than they were before, because they simply have a 100% mistrust of anything that comes out of the news cycle.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I've heard people say, wow, they'd rather vote for a pedophile than a Democrat. Well, A, he's not a pedophile. That's an actual disease. You know, he's probably a serial statutory rapist, but he's not a pedophile, because pedophiles are unable to be aroused by adults. Unable. You know, and that's clearly not the case here. But you know, it's an interesting commentary, you know, that the Republicans are trying to figure out how to deal with this situation now, because they're kind of strapped. They're hamstrung by, you know, Alabama has put in all of these wonderful laws, and one of them is that, you know, if the election is less than 49 days away, you can't be taken off the ballot. And if you remember, that goes back to the time when George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, and that law was put in after he was shot, so that he could go back on the ballot, and so that if he died in the meantime, he would remain on the ballot and get elected. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's how his wife got into the governorship.
Huh. Well,
so
there's another overriding problem in this society, and we all have to hug the women in our lives that we love, because it is coming out that and a lot of things we've known, the abuse of women, what goes on in every industry in terms of getting ahead, this, that, and the other thing. We don't know it to the extent that it is. It's crazy. Well-respected.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, it's a double-edged situation here. I mean, one side of it is if you will, really it comes down to power. And that probably goes all the way back to when we were divided into the tribes of hunters and gatherers. And then agriculture came along and you could have both. You could have hunters and gatherers. And the hunters kind of had supremacy because all the gatherers did was sit there and farm. You know, that wasn't very important. And that turned out to be women's work. And the women could, because they could raise the children and do that at the same time. It was pretty hard to take a nursing child out onto the hunt and, you know, also be able to successfully throw a spear and bring down a game animal, whether it was, you know, a raccoon or a woolly mammoth. It didn't really matter. You weren't going to be out dragging the kids around while you were hunting. And so the women stayed at home, and society evolved around these two sets of roles, and the men just usurped the power, decided that it accrued to them naturally because of their ability to do this job. And from that point forward, it's been kind of a societal norm. You get into this situation where that bad behavior was practiced so generally that we didn't think of it as bad behavior. It was never even discussed. There was never a question of whether it was bad behavior. It was just how things were. That doesn't excuse it. And the fact that people are saying, well, that's the way the culture was in the 1960s, I don't care. It was wrong. It was wrong then. It's wrong now. But it is instructive to know that it was so pervasive that nobody even questioned whether it was right or wrong. At least now we're beginning to look at it. I suspect that it's going to take another 50 to 100 years for society to fully evolve to a point where maybe this is no longer an issue. But you're absolutely correct. I do some work as a standardized patient. It's acting work for the medical school at UC San Francisco, and I find that more than 50% of the students there now are female. I mean, when I was thinking of going to medical school, if there were two women in an incoming class, it was a moment to mark. Now it's more than 50%. And the simple and really outrageous fact of the matter is women make better doctors than men. They may not have the same left-brain analytical thought processes that men do, but they make better doctors because it turns out that healing the whole person requires being able to see the whole person, and women are much better attuned to the emotional aspects and the interpersonal aspects and the interrelational aspects.
The nurturing part comes so naturally.
Yeah. It's a blanket statement, and no blanket statement is ever accurate. But I would say that as a general rule, women listen better than men do. And in the medical field, that turns out to be a highly important skill that has not existed for a very long time.
Well, they used to fluff it off. Well, that's just his, quote, bedside manner. He's a great doctor, but his bedside manner isn't good. Well, I beg to differ. You can't be a great doctor unless you have a bedside manner. You can call it what you want, but a way to communicate with your patient and get on the same side as your patient to want to save, so the patient knows you want to save his life. And I mean, that goes down as an intangible. You can't quantify how much that can mean to a person, and every person is different. Some people, well, I don't care what you say, doctor, just save me, just, I don't want to talk about it. But, if
the one exception that proves that rule, the one profession that I'll give a pass to in medicine is the surgeon. I will tell you from personal experience with my own son who had brain surgery at 9 days of age that I didn't give a rat's ass about the personality of the surgeon. I wanted the best goddamn mechanic I could find.
Right. No question about that.
And that's what I wound up with. I mean, the best mechanic I could find. I was warned in advance the guy has less personality than a used plastic bag. And it was true. It was absolutely true. But he was a spectacularly skillful surgeon. And what else do you want working in your child's brain? I don't care how nice the guy is. He's got to be perfect.
Right. Well, your son wasn't taking the bedside manner from him.
Nor were we.
Okay.
Yeah, nor were we. I mean, we went into it prepared. We were adequately prepared that this was how he was going to be. Don't take it personally, and we didn't. My son went in for 3 hours of brain surgery. The doctor comes out and he says he's going to be fine, and walked away. And you know what? That was it.
Was. Yeah.
Well, how far have we made it from Charlie Fox?
I don't know how from Charlie Fox, his baritone voice.
I do have a well, actually, Charlie, that's what I was about to ask you about. Talk about great minds. Did Charlie sing for you on his show?
He didn't. And
Charlie loved to sing, and his voice wasn't that high. When he sang, he was the quintessential Irish tenor.
It's funny. I did not know that about him at the time I did the interview. What I based the interview on was the fact that when Charlie Fox was 20 years old, he was a catcher. This is before the war, or 19, something like that, right out of high school. He was a catcher with the New York Giants. He caught Carl Hubble and Bill Vorcell and I think Dummy Hoy and what have you. 19, 20 years old. And he went in the service. He was in the Navy. And like so many young fellows that went into World War II, they just came out without their skills for one reason or another. And he did. And Stoneham kept him around as a scout, as a minor league manager. And he played that role in that year and it was a terrific year for the Giants. Because remember, they had so many bridesmaid seasons to the Dodgers in the 60s that this helped quite a bit. And there was the year that Bruce Keeson was getting married, and I remember him after the game, they took him away in a helicopter. They took him out of the stick in a helicopter to the airport to go back to wherever it was he was going to get married to. And the Pirates ended up beating them, and that wasn't fun for me.
No, they ran into Bob Robertson. Bob Robertson, yes. Who was at the height of his career, he was a journeyman, but he had one glorious week, and that one glorious week crushed the Giants.
Yep. And I thought that was as good a team as they fielded for a long time after that. In other words,
well, that was Juan Marshall's last year. That was Willie's last full season.
Right. And Marichal did not have a great year that year at all.
No, he did not. That was his last full season with the Giants, and then he moved on to, I guess, the Red Sox, and then horror of horrors, spent one game with the Dodgers.
Right, which was a real, given the Roseboro history, that's one I don't understand. I remember that Duke Snider was a Giant for a while. Del Crandall was a Giant for a while. but none of them looked as out of place in uniform as Juan Marichal did with the Dodgers.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever even seen a photograph of him in a Dodger uniform. I do know from having talked with him that he and Roseboro had a major rapprochement after that incident and that they became very close friends.
I don't know how close, very close friends. You know, how could you be?
They certainly. Let's put it this way. They
did it.
They were
buried the hatchet.
Absolutely. I mean, Roseboro was a very unique individual. You know, he was far enough behind Campy and Jackie that people kind of let it slide. But, you know, other than Campy, who was mixed, Roseboro was one of the very first black catchers to be able to go out there on a day-to-day basis. Elrod Hendricks, and the Yankees had a couple of guys. John Blanchard was one of them, but Roseboro
Blanchard was not a black person.
Oh,
Ellie
right.
Howard, you think?
Yeah, Ellie Howard. You're right. I mean, they were kind of a platoon, weren't they?
No, but Howard came in.
But you're right.
Yogi was going off, and Blanchard was the third string catcher. And in '61, Yogi hit over 20 home runs, Blanchard hit over 21, and Howard hit over 20 home runs. So that was quite a feat for the Yankees. I think that '61 Yankee team was the best team I've ever seen, up until certainly that time. Great team, very deep. Didn't get hurt. Didn't have great pitching per se, but it was the Maris Mantle year when they went for the home run.
Yeah, I got to see that team play at Chavez Ravine, as it was renamed. If the Dodgers weren't playing there, I got to see them play the Angels there the Angels of Albie Pearson.
Oh wow, that they were so quick to be in contention as an expansion team. I think it was a year or two. In the second year of their existence, they gave the Yankees some trouble in '62.
In '62, they were in first place on the 4th of July.
Whoa, that's some trouble. Second year, they had guys developing. Rogers, the catcher, was terrific. Fergosi was out of this world until he became a Met.
They had Ed Kirkpatrick on that team.
Yes. Averill, I remember the
Earl Averill, yeah.
Some of a great player at that time. And they had the immortal Bo Belinsky.
And Dean Chance.
Yes, and Chance was really good.
Yeah.
And Belinsky had a year or so. He had the no-hitter, and he got a lot of attention.
He had the no-hitter, and he had the convertible, and he had any female he wanted in Hollywood.
And
he was the pretty boy.
Mamie Van Doren he had a playmate of the year, I remember. Can't think of her name. He did well. He did well for a little hustler from Trenton, New Jersey.
Yeah, somewhere out in my shed, Ralph, I have a scorecard from Westgate Park in San Diego for a preseason game between the Giants and actually I think it was the Cleveland Indians they played, but Mamie Van Doren came to the game and it was the first sellout crowd in stadium history. Wow. It was for an exhibition game. And I remember that because, you know, when you're a 10-year-old boy the notion that you get to see a famous, sexy woman in person was like, the end of the world. It was like I could, what else is there to live for now? I've accomplished everything in life.
Right. And that's at 10, you're already thinking about it. Way to go, big guy.
Well, I came from an Italian family. We were a little advanced.
Okay. Well, we were a little advanced, too, in our own different little way around my place. Did you become an American League fan at that time, or did it not matter? Did it cease to matter to you? Because growing up with National League teams, it was before the DH. There wasn't that big a difference between leagues.
There wasn't, except that the National League, because it had embraced African-American players much more wholeheartedly than the American League had, the National League was in the middle of a run of, I think, 17 straight victories in the All-Star game. And that was always a source of pride. I don't know. I always thought of the National League as being a complete league and the American League as being where guys went to play when they no longer had the speed to play in the National League.
That's a way of looking at it. Absolutely.
The American League just seems slower.
I'll give you one angel that had a National League background with the San Francisco Giants. That's Daddy Wags. What are your memories of John Wagner?
Well, I don't have a lot of memories of Leon Wagner. I was very young when he came up with the Giants, but I do remember him being out there in the outfield, and I do remember him being part of a very feared chunk of that lineup, with Mays and either Cepeda or McCovey and Wagner in the middle of the lineup. There were no easy days pitching a candlestick in those days. I know that.
Sure.
When he got to Anaheim, he was not quite as fearsome. The American League seemed to have more sluggers, and so he dropped down on the list a little bit in that area. And my recollection is that the ballpark that they played in was bigger, and it was not conducive to home runs as much as Candlestick was if you had learned to go to right field and ride the wind. So it seemed like his numbers were not as good in Anaheim or in whatever they called themselves that week, but for the Angels as they were for the Giants. But I also attributed that to just the fact that he was a little older and he wasn't surrounded with quite the same level of talent that he had in San Francisco.
Right. Gene Autry, the owner of that team, do you have recollection of him at all?
Well, I've seen a few movies.
Okay. That'll do. Speaking of movies, I remember when Bob Hope owned a big portion of the Cleveland Indians, and Bing Crosby owned a big piece of the Pittsburgh Pirates. And celebrities owning teams or partial ownerships in teams wasn't unusual in those days.
But do you remember when Danny Kaye owned a piece of the Seattle team?
I don't, but I do remember that Danny Kaye song about the Giants and Dodgers. Hiller goes to Miller, Miller goes to Ditter, Hiller goes that was as clever a rendition of any baseball song as I've ever heard. That was a good one. And O'Malley wants the attendance to go up. I remember that little lyric. So
a portion of that lyric is actually painted out on the outside of the press box at AT&T.
Really?
It's called the Hiller Haller Miller Shuffle.
Yes. And for a long time, Timmy Haller, Tom's son, and I co-hosted this very Giant show that we're on. And Timmy loves that song about his dad. His dad was a terrific guy, Tom Halla.
I never had the pleasure of meeting him. I have certainly met people who knew him who all speak highly of him.
Yeah. Wasn't the greatest general manager that ever walked down the pipe, as it turns out, but he got a lot of he hired Frank Robinson. I thought that was terrific. Right there. Just having Frank classed up the place when it needed it.
Yeah, and without Frank Robinson, we wouldn't even know who Jim Barr was.
Okay. Jim Barr from Sacramento has been a guest on these airwaves.
And he had a marvelous career. He was a great pitcher, and for a long time held the major league record for most consecutive batters retired. But the only thing that Jim is remembered for is his little contretemps with Frank on the mound.
Yes. And what he should be remembered for is after his career was over, Jim Barr pitched amateur ball, like semi-pro ball, in the Northern California area for a long time. And he's coaching up in Sacramento. I think it's Sac State, if I'm not mistaken.
He is the coach at Sac State, and I'll tell you something. Just to show you how people's attitudes and personalities can change as they age. When he has his first team meeting each winter with his ball club, first thing he does is he shows them film of that little set-to on the mound with Frank Robinson. And when the film stops running, he looks at his players and he says, if any one of you tries that, you're history.
So he can go back and learn from his...
I felt like I had the right to do that because I was an established major leaguer, and I was wrong.
And he was wrong.
Yeah.
He gave the Giants some very, very good years, very good innings. I don't know why when I think of Jim Barr, I think of Al Holland and Gott and those guys that they got from Pittsburgh that came over and gave them great innings.
Yeah, well, I do remember them. I did have the pleasure of meeting and still being friends with Jim Gott, great guy from San Marino. So we had a little something in common since I lived in San Gabriel and went to Pasadena High. He and Mike Krukow and I were all kind of contemporaries in high school. And we all played against each other, but we didn't really have any idea who each other was at the time. It was 25 years later before we really sorted all that out.
Michael, people listening from all over the country that don't know California say, well, I'm in Northern California, you're in Northern California, I grew up in New York, you grew up in Southern California. Now, talk about the differences, if you will, in life in Southern California and life in Northern California.
Well, the most succinct way that I can put it is in Northern California, we put clothes on to go to the beach.
The beaches up in Northern California, yes, indeed. That's
we have beaches, we have surf, but we have a different level of respect. There is a world of difference between 60-degree water and 70-degree water, and that's the difference between Northern and Southern California. In Northern California, we fish in water we can drink. In Southern California, there's precious little fresh water around, and where it is, it's in a lake. There's a difference in, I would really tend to categorize the primary difference to me, Ralph, as the Bay Area in particular feels urban in much the same way that Manhattan feels urban or the Loop in Chicago feels urban. Southern California feels suburban. Certainly not rural, but suburban. I've always described Los Angeles as 93 suburbs in search of a city center.
Gotcha. That's
yeah.
And outside of the cities in Northern California, the suburban area is a lot like that.
Yeah, and if you will, I think the other major differences are just in the feeling that you get around you. If you're outside of the urban core of Los Angeles, let's say you're in Glendora or Rubidoux, you're what's known as the Inland Empire. You can go on a hike, and there's places out there that are unspoiled, but it's like big rocks and dryness and heat. There's no forests to speak of. When you come to the sign on I-5...
There's nothing like the redwoods, in other words.
Oh, no, nothing like the redwoods at all, but there's not even any riparian forest. I mean, to me, it was always amusing going down I-5. You pass the big sign that says, "Welcome to the Angeles National Forest," and there's not a tree in sight.
Right.
And to me, that was always the biggest difference is that in Los Angeles, if you get an inch and a half or 2 inches of rain, it's green for a week, and it softens everything about the area. It even softens people's attitudes. They become kinder. They become more engaged. To me, I think there's something about living in a desert environment that reminds you that you're in competition to stay alive. It's not, to use a word you used earlier, it's not a nurturing environment in the same way that Northern California and the Pacific Northwest are, where, you're surrounded by lushness and abundance everywhere.
Has Northern California, what with the driving problems and the traffic jams and what have you, has it become more like Southern California of late?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it has.
That's pretty. I've been noticing it, and it's kind of depressing.
Well, it is. I mean, the problem is, it's one of the most popular places on the planet for people to live, and when 65% of your land mass is water in a region, it becomes difficult to have enough room to accommodate everybody who wants to live there. Fortunately, all of our hilltops and all of our ridge lines are preserved. They're all parkland, but that means that another 15% of our land is not buildable. And when you add that to the water that's not buildable, there's not a heck of a lot left. So we have that kind of odd situation where we are being loved to death, I think.
Well, what's going to kill it all for me, as far as I'm concerned, is the price of housing and how it's driving our neighbors out.
It's not a good place to be a renter. I will say that.
Yeah.
If you are fortunate enough to have gotten into a house, then, you're riding the same elevator with everybody else and you're probably okay. But if you're renting, then you're at the mercy of what happens when your property changes hands and you get a new landlord who paid twice as much for it and whose monthly nut is twice as much, and they need you to cover it.
Well, there's also some downside to buying a home because you buy a home and the tax rate is so exorbitant. If you're lucky enough to be grandfathered in to the old Prop 11 or whatever?
13.
13. That keeps the taxes level. That's a big advantage. So, and then the maintenance of it all. I don't know, and we don't know when the next bubble is coming as well.
Oh, well, we always know when the next bubble is coming. We're in it.
When it's going to burst.
We're in it. Yes, exactly.
We're in the bubble. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is just one of those things, Ralph, that you kind of have to say every place and everything has a cost. And this is part of the cost of being here. If you want to be here, you have to suck it up and accept that it's going to take more of your income to have a place to live than it is in other places. I travel a lot, and, I look around and I see that I could have, for what I have as equity in my home, I could probably go out and own 20 acres in Ames, Iowa.
I was just going to say, Iowa's a great example. I take the train when I travel. Took the train through Iowa last year, and it was the early fall, so it was beautiful, the weather. I can't imagine living in that Iowa in the winter. Those 20 acres in the summer are a lot different.
In the winter it's going to be nasty cold and windy as hell, and in the summer it's going to be sticky beyond your wildest dreams.
Right.
And you're in Iowa, and there's nothing wrong with Iowa, but Lenny Kravitz doesn't.
Got a lot of Iowans around you there.
Well, but Lenny Kravitz doesn't come to town and do a concert at the ballpark on Tuesdays in Iowa.
That's true. And what a gem of a ballpark he has to do it in.
Yeah, that was quite a week for the ballpark. I don't know if you know, but the concert at Dreamforce is not a giveaway. Benioff does not say come to the conference and we'll give you a free ticket to the concert. The concert tickets are sold, and they raise funds for the Dreamforce Foundation, which puts money into Benioff Children's Hospital at UCSF. So in 1 week, really in 3 days, at that venue, $38 million was raised for charities. $15 million for the Dreamforce and $23 million for the Napa fire relief. That's what I call having a good week.
Right.
They don't elect.
And what was really nice, they all came free. All the entertainers performed free, and they were happy to do it.
Exactly. And like I say, we don't have a Stadium of the Week award, but I think AT&T won it for that week.
Good. That's a high note to end the show, Michael. Right there.
Consider it done.
$38 million to take care of the community we live in. That's nice. It is. And I think the Giants are to be commended for making the facility available and providing all the staffing for both of those concerts. And, it costs money to do things like that, and they are happy to participate in the community like that and do stuff like that, but they are oftentimes kind of ignored. People look at it and assume that they're just making more money doing something like that, and in fact they're not. Well, it's nice to set the record straight, Michael. You work for a terrific organization, San Francisco Giants.
Well, my wife works for them. I work near them. But
yes.
I appreciate the compliment anyway. She is very proud to be associated with the organization.
And you are too. You wear that ring very proudly.
Yeah, I do.
Good. Keep wearing it. I have a replica ring that was given out at AT&T maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It's a replica ring of the 54 World Series played in New York. And I wear that. It's too big and bulky to wear on a regular basis, but I'll put it on and get closer to the feeling every now and again. And I love it. They did well with that ring. It was a good giveaway. Thank you, Michael. I enjoyed talking with you. And we'll do it again same time next week, whatever time that is. I appreciate your company.
I'll be there. Thank you so much.
Good. And if you listen out there and you enjoy anything about this offering or any of our offerings on Comfortably Zoned, I request that you accumulate some lightly used children's books and put them in a carton, take them down to your Head Start program whatever city you live in, there's a Head Start program. And if you could get kids reading and ready for kindergarten, that would be a nice thing. So think about that, and we will be back. Everybody, keep on keeping on. Thank you again, Michael Duca. Adios, everybody.